owed you something good. He knew better than to believe that. He was finishing the last section of the third
We
floor
have to go
corridor when
now!
Gordon
He's
Marsh,
not
the
going
shift
anywhere.
manager, found him
Please,
near
you
the
don't
supply
understand!
closet. Gordon was a decent man in the way that men who never make waves are decent, reliable, forgettable, the kind of person who remembered your birthday but forgot your last name. He held out a manila envelope like it contained something fragile. HR needs this signed before 8, Gordon said. Position upgrade. Level 2 maintenance tech. Just go to the 6th floor, sign the form, come back down. 5 minutes. Cole looked at the envelope. The words Level 2 maintenance tech landed with a dull weight he didn't examine. It wasn't ambition. It was arithmetic, a few more dollars per hour, which meant the dentist appointment Mia needed before spring, which meant one less thing to calculate before he closed his eyes at night. He took the envelope. "Mia's downstairs," he said. "No babysitter today." Gordon waved it off. "She can sit in the lobby. It's 5 minutes, Cole." It was always 5 minutes. Cole had learned that in the Air Force, where 5 minutes meant anything from 3 hours to never, but he had also learned that arguing about time estimation with people who outranked you was a battle with no tactical upside. He tucked the envelope under his arm and went downstairs. Mia was exactly where he'd left her, in the chair closest to the window, backpack between her feet, a book open across her knees. She was 8 years old, and she read the way some kids watch television, completely without blinking, the rest of the world reduced to background noise. The book was dog-eared at the corners from being opened and closed so many times, the spine held together with a piece of clear tape she had applied herself. How Machines Fly. He'd found it at a used bookstore on Grant Road, $3.50, and when he'd handed it to her, she had looked at the cover for exactly 2 seconds before opening to page 1. That had been 6 weeks ago. She was on her 4th read-through. The lobby guard, a heavy-set man named Derek, who was 2 years from retirement and had the relaxed energy of someone counting down the days, had glanced over at Mia when Cole came down. "She's been telling me about lift coefficients," Derek said. "I don't know what that means." Mia didn't look up from her book. "It means the ratio of lift force to dynamic pressure times the wing area," she said with the patience of someone explaining something for the 3rd time to the same person. "If the ratio is too low, the plane falls." Derek looked at Cole. Cole nodded. This was just Mia. He crouched down next to her chair. "I have to go upstairs for 5 minutes. Sign a form. You stay here, you don't move, and—" He paused. "You don't take anything apart." Mia finally looked up. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that was almost amber in direct light, and she used them now in the way she used them when she was deciding how literally to interpret a set of instructions. "What if something's already broken?" she asked. "Then it can stay broken until I get back," Cole said. She considered this with the gravity of a federal judge. "Okay," she said. He stood up, adjusted the envelope, and went to the elevator. He was aware as he rode up to the 6th floor of the mop handle he'd leaned against the supply closet wall on 3. He had meant to take it back down. He had forgotten. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter on any other morning. He would think about that later, about how the whole architecture of what followed was built on the accumulation of small things that individually meant nothing. The 6th floor was a different country from the floors below. The carpet was a deep charcoal gray that absorbed sound. The light was warmer, more considered, the kind of light that cost money to produce and was designed to make people feel that important decisions were being made here. Cole walked toward the HR suite with his eyes forward, the way he'd learned to move through spaces where he didn't belong, not invisibly exactly, but without friction, not giving anyone a reason to look at him twice. He had gotten good at that over the past 14 months. It was a skill he hadn't expected to need after the Air Force, and he'd spent a long time not examining what it said about him that he'd had to learn it. He was 10 feet from the HR door when the elevator at the far end of the corridor chimed. Diane Ashworth walked out the way people walk when they have never once in their professional life been the least important person in any room they've entered. She was 52 years old, and she wore it like a credential. Not young, not trying to be the kind of woman whose authority had calcified over years of decisions and consequences into something harder and more permanent than confidence. Behind her came 4 men in suits, the particular uniform of people who fly to meetings rather than drive. They had the slightly disoriented look of travelers who had left cold cities before dawn and were still recalibrating to Arizona sun, though the windows on this floor faced north and the sun didn't reach them here. Cole stopped. Not because he was afraid or even particularly concerned. He stopped because the smart thing to do when the CEO of the company you work for exits an elevator and walks toward you is to stop and let her pass. He stepped slightly to the right toward the wall, making himself smaller in the way he'd been doing on this floor for 14 months. It didn't work. Diane Ashworth's gaze moved across the corridor the way radar moves, sweeping automatic built to find things out of place. It found Cole. It found the manila envelope in his hand. It found the maintenance uniform, the worn boots, the particular quality of stillness he had that was different from the stillness of men who belonged on this floor. And then it found somehow, before it found Mia, the mop handle that was not there, but was implied by every other thing it had already found. Who authorized a janitor on the executive floor? Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was calibrated for exactly this purpose, for carrying across a carpeted corridor with enough clarity that the people it was not addressed to could hear it perfectly. The marketing director behind Diane, a thin woman named Paige Sellers with highlighted hair and a very fast smile, laughed the way people laugh when they are relieved the thing isn't aimed at them. One of the investors shifted his weight. Another checked his phone. Cole lifted the envelope. "I'm here to sign a form for HR," he started. "Personnel upgrade. The shift manager sent me up. Badge." Diane said it the way you say a word when you've already moved past what the word represents. Not a question, not even really a command, a conclusion she'd already reached. Cole felt something go quiet inside him. Not the desperate, hollow quiet of a man who's afraid, but the particular stillness that settles in when you have already survived things that were worse than this, and your nervous system has learned to conserve its resources. He thought about the number in his bank account. He thought about Mia's dental appointment. He thought about the 11 months he'd spent finding this job after the last one, the 43 applications, the 6 callbacks, the 2 interviews that went well followed by rejections that came in emails shorter than his name. He thought about all of that in approximately 1 second, which is how long it takes a man who has done the math many times to do it again. Then he heard the elevator open. He hadn't realized Mia had come up. He didn't know what she'd told Derek, or whether she'd simply walked into the elevator when his back was turned, or whether 5 minutes had felt like longer to her than it had to him. She was standing 15 feet back down the corridor with her backpack on and her book held against her chest, and she was looking at the scene in front of her with the focused, assessing attention she brought to everything. Mechanical, taking it apart in her mind, understanding how the pieces connected, deciding what was wrong and whether it could be fixed. She did not cry. That was the thing he would remember later when he was trying to explain to himself what it meant. 8 years old in a strange corridor, watching a woman in a suit tell her father he needed to give up his badge, and Mia Decker did not cry. She pressed her book a little harder against her chest. She breathed in through her nose once slowly, and the look on her face was not the look of a child who doesn't understand what's happening. It was the look of a child who understands exactly what's happening and has decided that the most useful thing she can do is not make it harder. Cole had taught her that without meaning to. He understood that in the same second he saw it. He unclipped his badge. The small LED on the card reader on Diane's side of the corridor went dark before he even held it out. Someone had already called it in the system, already updated the decision, already formalized in whatever database tracked the comings and goings of men in maintenance uniforms on floors where they didn't belong. He set the badge on the small ledge beside the reader. He picked up the manila envelope. He thought about leaving it, then thought that seemed dramatic, so he tucked it under his arm and walked back toward Mia. He crouched down when he reached her. He adjusted the collar of her jacket, which didn't need adjusting because he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't fists. "We're going to sit outside for a minute," he said. Mia looked at him. "The helicopter's out there," she said. "I saw it when we drove in." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "it is." She nodded once, the same deliberate nod she used when she had processed a piece of information and filed it in the appropriate place, and she took his hand. Diane Ashworth did not watch them leave. She had already turned toward her investors, was already saying something about the timeline. Her voice smooth and continuous, moving on with the precision of a woman for whom this kind of interruption was a 2-second event in a day built entirely of decisions. On the elevator ride down, Cole stared at the panel of buttons without seeing them, and Mia stood next to him with her hand still in his and her book still against her chest, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say yet that wouldn't cost too much. Outside, the Arizona cold was clean and sharp in the way that desert cold is not the heavy, wet cold of places with weather, but a dry precision that found every gap in your clothing and made itself known there. Cole and Mia sat on a low concrete barrier at the edge of the company's private airfield, and for a while, Cole just breathed. The airfield was separated from the main building complex by a chain-link fence topped with 3-strand wire, and beyond the fence under floodlights that were still running. Despite the morning sun, Halverson's newest achievement sat on the tarmac surrounded by technicians. The Skyguard 7 was a beautiful machine. Cole knew enough about beautiful machines to understand that beauty in engineering was not decoration. It was the visible signature of function, optimized past the point of necessity, the aesthetic byproduct of solving a problem so thoroughly that the solution became its own argument. The Skyguard 7 was a rescue helicopter built for the kind of operations where the margin between a successful extraction and a body recovery was measured in minutes and centimeters. It was also, from what Cole had gathered over 14 months of cleaning the corridors near the engineering wing, the project that was supposed to transform Halverson from a regional aerospace contractor into a company with a DoD contract worth 9 figures and a new building with its name on it. Mia was looking at it the way she looked at her book, completely cataloging. "It's bigger in real life," she said. Cole nodded. "Most things are." He was looking at it too, but not the way she was. He was looking at the way the technicians moved around it, the way the floodlights caught the rotor assembly, the particular angle at which the tail boom was oriented relative to the fuselage. He was looking at it the way you look at something you know well, when you haven't seen it in a long time, not with nostalgia exactly, but with the specific awareness of a man who had spent 7 years of his professional life thinking about how machines like this could fail. He pulled out his phone. The bank application opened to the same number it always did, which was a number that required him to make certain decisions in a certain order. He had a specific methodology for financial problems. First, identify what was fixed rent, utilities, Mia's school expenses. Second, identify what was variable groceries, transportation, anything that could be compressed or delayed. Third, identify what was urgent, the dental appointment in 2 weeks, the registration renewal on the truck, the winter jacket Mia had outgrown. He worked through it now with the focused efficiency of a man who had run this particular calculation enough times that he could do it quickly, which was its own kind of skill, even if it wasn't the kind anyone put on a resume. The numbers came out the way they usually came out, which was to say they came out requiring him to make choices he hadn't wanted to make. He closed the app. He watched a technician walk the perimeter of the Skyguard 7 with a clipboard. He thought about the 11 months after the Air Force, the gap years before that, the particular accounting of a life that had been built one direction and then been required to rebuild itself from different materials. Mia leaned into his shoulder. She had opened her book again because Mia's response to waiting was always to read, and she had learned early that her father sometimes needed to be quiet without being alone. He put his arm around her, and she turned a page without looking up. He felt the vibration before he heard it. It was in the concrete under his feet first, a subtle low-frequency tremor that had no business being there given where the helicopter was in its startup sequence. Cole knew startup sequences. He knew them the way musicians know scales, not consciously, not as a list of steps, but as a felt thing, a pattern his nervous system had encoded over years of proximity to machines that could kill you if you stopped paying attention. The vibration was wrong. Not dangerously wrong, not yet, but wrong in the specific way that things are wrong, 2 steps before they become dangerous. He lifted his head. He looked at the Skyguard 7. The rotor was spinning up, which was normal. The pitch of the rotation was slightly off, which was not. It was the kind of thing you would miss if you were looking at a checklist. It was not the kind of thing you could miss if you had spent years listening. "Mia," he said. She turned a page. "Mia." She looked up. He was already standing. "You hear that?" She tilted her head the way she always did when she was actually listening to something rather than waiting for it to finish. Her eyes went slightly unfocused. She did this internal listening when she was trying to map sound to something she already knew. Then, "It sounds like when our washing machine was off balance," she said. "The drum wobble." He looked at her. She had identified in her own 8-year-old taxonomy exactly the category of failure he was hearing. Cascade resonance, the mechanical equivalent of a feedback loop that didn't know how to stop. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move. Whatever you see, stay on this side of the fence." Mia looked at him with the amber eyes that were her mother's, and she said, "How long, which was not the question he'd expected, and it was better than any of the questions she could have asked, because it told him she had already understood what she wasn't supposed to do, and was only asking about the timeline. "I don't know," he said, "but you stay here until I come back, or until someone in a uniform comes and gets you. Not someone in a suit, a uniform." She nodded. He ran. The guard at the fence access point was a young man Cole recognized from the night shift overlap. His name was either Trent or Brett, something abbreviated and sharp, and he had the look of someone who had been told the most important part of his job was looking like the most important part was possible. Cole reached him at a speed that was too fast to ignore and said, "Your stabilizer loop is going into runaway feedback. That helicopter has 40 seconds before the oscillation cascade locks the pilot out of primary control." Trent or Brett looked at him with the expression of a man who had been trained to respond to unauthorized personnel and unauthorized statements, but had not been specifically prepared for both at the same time. "Sir, you need to step back from the—" Cole was already past him. He knew where the hangar control suite was. 14 months. He had cleaned that hangar floor every Thursday morning. He knew which doors were propped, which codes hadn't been changed since the Sentinel acquisition, which side entrance the technicians used when they were running late and didn't want to go through the main bay. He went through the side entrance. The control suite was running at full alert, which meant everyone was doing something, but no one had identified what they were doing it about. 3 technicians were at the primary console pulling up diagnostic windows that were giving them readings they didn't know how to interpret, because the readings were coming from a system layer they didn't know existed. A 4th was on a headset, talking to the pilot in a voice that was trying to be calm, but was already acquiring the particular texture of controlled panic. The words were right, but the rhythm was wrong, and the pilot on the other end would be able to hear the rhythm even if he couldn't parse the words. Cole moved directly to the console. The nearest technician stepped in front of him by reflex. "You can't be in here. This is a restricted—" Cole looked at the primary screen while the man was still speaking. The telemetry was clean enough. He could see exactly where the fault was, could read it in the oscillation pattern, the same way he could read a waveform, the same way he could read any language he'd spent enough years speaking. "Left compensator autonomy," he said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular. "Cut it and reassign pitch authority to manual override secondary board subsystem 7. The technician grabbed his arm. Cole kept reading the screen. "If you don't do that in the next 20 seconds, your pilot is going to lose lateral control entirely, and there will be nothing left to manage." He heard a stillness behind him that was different from the general noise of the room, a quality of stopped motion that meant someone had heard him say something that landed differently than everything else in the room had landed. He turned his head slightly. Ray Kowalski was standing at the back of the suite near the secondary diagnostics board, and Ray Kowalski was looking at him with an expression Cole had not seen directed at him in a very long time. Not the look of a man deciding whether to call security, but the look of a man rapidly rearranging information he already has into a new configuration. Ray was 51 years old, and he had a master's degree in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech, and he had spent 23 years thinking carefully about the specific problem of what happens when experimental rotorcraft systems fail in non-standard ways. In 2011, at a conference in Atlanta that Cole had attended as a presenting researcher from the Air Force's Experimental Systems Division, Ray Kowalski had been in the third row when Cole delivered a paper on emergency stabilization protocols for high-risk rotorcraft. Ray had not approached him afterward. He had, however, gone home and read the paper twice more, and he had remembered the name on the title page the way engineers sometimes remember the names attached to solutions for problems they'd been carrying. "Step aside," Ray said to the technician holding Cole's arm. It wasn't loud. It had no particular force behind it. It was simply the voice of a man who had already decided. The technician stepped aside. Ray crossed the suite in 4 steps and stood next to Cole and looked at the same screen, and for 3 seconds both of them read the same data and arrived at the same conclusion. "Subsystem 7 is masked," Ray said. "It's not on the standard interface." Cole reached past him and entered a command sequence on the secondary input, not fast, not theatrical, with the deliberate speed of muscle memory fingers that had typed this specific sequence in this specific order in the dark, in heat, in noise, in conditions this suite had never been designed to simulate. A secondary menu appeared below the standard interface layer. Ray looked at it. Then Ray looked at Cole. "Who are you?" Cole was already working. "Get your pilot on the line," he said. "Tell him to stop fighting the lateral and go passive on the collective. He can't win that fight right now. Don't let him try." Ray put on a headset. What followed was 4 minutes and 11 seconds of work that Cole would not be able to fully describe later. Not because it was mysterious, but because it was technical in a way that required a specific vocabulary, and because he had done it largely without thinking. Which is what happens when the body executes something the mind stopped having to supervise years ago. He cut the left compensator's autonomous function and pushed pitch authority to a manual subsystem that Halverson's engineers had inherited from Sentinel without knowing they had it. He entered a stabilization sequence that existed in classified USAF documentation from 2009 and that had never been transcribed into any civilian maintenance manual for any aircraft built from Sentinel's legacy systems. He talked quietly while he worked, not to anyone in the room but to the machine. Not in the mystical sense, but in the practical sense that speaking the steps aloud was how he had been trained to execute emergency protocols, because voice externalization reduced cognitive errors under pressure by approximately 15%, a figure he could have cited with a source if anyone had asked. The oscillation slowed. The descent rate curve on the telemetry screen changed shape. The pilot's voice in Ray's headset shifted from compressed and rapid to something more measured, still afraid, still working hard, but no longer fighting alone. The Skyguard 7 came down on the far section of the tarmac, in a landing that was brutal in the way that a landing you survive is brutal, hard, sparking, loud enough to rattle the hangar windows, the skids screaming against the concrete in a sound like something being torn rather than placed. But it stayed upright. The rotor torque dissipated. The emergency systems cycled down into a kind of shuddering silence, and on the telemetry screen the lines that had been describing a disaster curved slowly, reluctantly back toward something that meant the machine was stopped and the man inside it was still alive. The room didn't cheer. It exhaled. There is a difference, and this was the latter, the collective release of breath held by people who had been doing the calculation of what they were about to witness and had just been informed they were wrong. Ray took off the headset. He set it on the console with care, the way you handle things when your hands are not entirely steady. He looked at Cole. Cole was looking through the hangar window at the tarmac, where the Skyguard 7 sat, damaged but intact, and where 30 feet beyond the fence line, Mia Decker stood exactly where he had told her to stand, holding her book against her chest, watching. He raised his hand. She raised hers. "Who are you?" Ray asked again. And this time it was not a challenge. It was a question with weight behind it, a question that had already started accumulating answers Ray was trying to arrange in order. "I'm the man they fired this morning," Cole said. Ray was quiet for a moment. Outside, the pilot was being helped from the cockpit by 2 technicians, and the investors who had been on the executive terrace were starting to come down, and Diane Ashworth was somewhere above them, moving toward the same place they were all moving toward. Ray looked at the screen at the stabilization sequence Cole had entered at the command layer that had appeared below the standard interface and that none of his engineers had known was there. "You wrote a paper," Ray said. "Atlanta 2011. Emergency Stabilization in Compound Rotor Systems with Legacy Military Architecture." Cole looked at him. "You were in the 3rd row," Cole said. Ray nodded slowly. "I've read it 3 times. He paused. "I never thought I'd need it." Cole turned back to the window. On the tarmac, the pilot was on his knees with his head down, and the medics were reaching him now, and the machine that had nearly killed him stood above him with its skids bent and its paintwork scratched and its data intact because a man in a maintenance uniform had run across an airfield and typed a sequence no one here had known to type. Paige Sellers came through the hangar door first, followed by 2 of the investors, and then a beat behind them with the measured pace of someone who has decided to arrive rather than rush Diane Ashworth. She stopped when she saw Cole. The room was still. The investors were watching, the technicians were watching, and Ray Kowalski stood next to Cole with the posture of a man who had already decided which side of a line he was standing on. Diane looked at Cole the way she had looked at him upstairs, assessing, categorizing. But the categories were different now, and they both knew it, and the knowing made her jaw tighten in a way she controlled but didn't eliminate. "You shouldn't have been able to do that," she said. It was not a question, and it was not quite a statement. It was the sound of a woman whose model of the world had just produced an error it couldn't explain. Cole met her gaze without temperature in either direction. "Your stabilizer loop was misconfigured," he said. "Your pilot never had primary control." "I'm not talking about the aircraft," she said. The room was very quiet. "I'm talking about you." He waited. She looked at the screen at the command interface at the evidence of something she could not yet classify. "Those commands aren't in any manual I've authorized," she said. "Who taught you that sequence?" He considered for a moment, giving her the full answer. He considered what the full answer would open, and whether this was the right room to open it in with investors watching, and a pilot still on his knees on the tarmac, and a company in the first 10 minutes of understanding that its morning had not gone the way it planned. He decided on the version that was true without being complete. "A different life," he said, "before the uniform you saw this morning." The silence that followed had texture. One of the investors, the older one, Tom Reardon, the one who had checked his phone upstairs when Cole was being dismissed, was looking at Cole now with an expression that had nothing to do with phones. Paige Sellers had stopped smiling in a way that suggested she was recalculating something and hadn't finished yet. It was Ray who moved first. He stepped to the secondary console and pulled up the firmware log window, the one Cole had noticed on his way in, the one that had snagged on something in the back of his mind the way a thread snags on a splinter. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then, Cole. Not a question, not a command. His voice had the quality of a man who has just found something in a drawer he didn't put there. Cole crossed to him. On the screen, a firmware update timestamp, 11:47 p.m. Last night. A freeze protocol was standard procedure for the 48 hours before a certification flight. Someone had pushed a system modification through at 11:47 on the night before the most important test flight Halverson had ever run. Cole looked at the timestamp. He looked at the modification tag. He looked at the access credentials attached to the update. He looked at Ray. Ray's expression was the expression of a man who has done a great deal of careful work for a great many years and has just realized that careful work was not enough because someone else in the building was doing a different kind of work entirely. "Who has authorization to push firmware updates after a freeze?" Cole asked, keeping his voice low. "No one," Ray said. "That's what the freeze means." Cole pointed to the credential tag on the update. Ray looked at it. The name was there attached to an account that should have been inactive, a subcontractor who had finished his work weeks ago and whose system access should have been terminated when his contract ended. Ray looked at the name, and then looked at the timestamp, and then looked at Cole, and what passed between them in that look was not a conclusion, but the beginning of one which is more dangerous. "This wasn't an accident," Ray said. He said it quietly enough that only Cole heard it. The investors were talking among themselves. Diane was watching her engineers run preliminary exterior checks on the Skyguard 7 through the window. The pilot had been loaded onto a gurney and was being moved toward the medical station. Outside the fence, Mia had sat back down on the concrete barrier and was reading her book. Cole looked at the timestamp one more time. He looked at the aircraft on the tarmac, battered and upright, saved not because the system worked, but because one man had known where the system hid its last resort. He thought about who might know that. He thought about the freeze protocol and the inactive account and the 1147 that shouldn't exist. He thought about 14 months of cleaning floors and being looked through. Someone in this building had wanted the Skyguard 7 to come down this morning, and they had built the failure carefully, quietly over time in the spaces where no one was looking, which meant they had believed with confidence that no one would know where to look. Word count 3,412. He had given them reason to believe that. For 14 months he had given everyone in this building every reason to believe exactly that. He straightened up. He looked at Ray. "I need to see the full firmware history," he said. "Not the summary log, the raw data, every modification going back to when Sentinel's architecture was integrated." Ray didn't ask why. Men who have been standing at secondary consoles for 23 years know the difference between someone who is fishing and someone who already has the line in the water. "The boardroom wants you upstairs," Ray said. "Diane called it in while you were at the console." Cole nodded. He looked once more at the timestamp. "Pull the raw data while I'm in there," he said. "And Ray." Ray looked at him. "Don't let anyone touch that secondary interface, not to clean it up, not to restore standard view. Leave it exactly the way I left it." Ray looked at the screen at the military command layer still visible below the civilian surface, the ghost of a system that Halverson hadn't known it owned. "Understood," he said. Cole walked toward the hangar door. Behind him the room was already in motion, technicians beginning assessments, guards adjusting positions, investors moving in clusters with the tentative energy of men who had expected to watch a success and were trying to determine what they had watched instead. Cole passed through the door into the flat Arizona morning light, crossed toward the building's main entrance, and did not look at the tarmac or the damaged helicopter or the investors or the security cameras tracking his movement. He looked at Mia. She had her finger on a page, holding her place, watching him cross the yard. He held up one finger. "One more minute." She held up her book. She'd wait. He went inside. The elevator to the executive floor felt different on the way up. The same buttons, the same brushed steel walls, the same faint mechanical hum. But Cole was different in it now, not because anything about him had changed, but because the building's relationship to him had, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of a shift in pressure before weather. Upstairs he had been a problem to be removed. Now he was a question no one in the building knew how to answer, and questions had a different gravitational pull than problems. The boardroom was the kind of room that announced itself before you entered it. The double doors, the glass walls that let you see the long obsidian table, and the people arranged around it before they could see you fully, the quality of light that was bright enough to illuminate without being honest enough to flatter. Cole went in. The room took him in with a collective shift of attention that he felt physically, a change in the air, the way a room changes when a window opens somewhere. Diane was at the head of the table. The investors flanked her, Tom Reardon on the left, the others arranged with the careful spacing of men who understood that where you sat in a room was a form of communication. Paige Sellers was against the wall, notepad, open, pen moving. Ray's engineers occupied a cluster of chairs along one side. The pilot appeared on a monitor at the far end of the table, patched in from the medical station, pale and wearing an oxygen mask that he kept touching self-consciously, the way people touch new medical equipment while still adjusting to what it means that they need it. Cole stood at the far end of the table. No one offered him a seat, and he didn't ask for one. Diane ran the opening the way she ran everything controlled, precise, oriented toward the outcome she had determined before the meeting started. She asked the senior engineer to describe the failure. The engineer described it in the language of civilian aerospace maintenance, the vocabulary of a field that had not known until 40 minutes ago that it was working on a system with a deeper vocabulary beneath it. When the engineer reached the part where Cole had intervened, he paused. He said the word janitor, and then paused again because the word had acquired a different resonance than it had carried at the beginning of the day. It hung in the air above the obsidian table, and no one moved to take it down. Sandra Lim, the quietest of the investors, spoke before Diane could redirect. "What is your background?" she asked Cole, not with aggression, not with the performance of someone asking a rhetorical question, with the directness of someone who wanted actual information and had decided that the most efficient way to get it was to ask. Cole looked at her. "Air Force," he said. "Flight Systems Engineering, Experimental Rotorcraft Division, most of it classified. I separated in 2016 when my daughter was born." He paused. "I needed stability more than deployments." Sandra Lim wrote something on her notepad. Tom Reardon had put his phone face down on the table, which was a gesture Cole had seen before in rooms where someone was deciding to pay attention. And for the past 14 months, Reardon said, his voice carrying the particular dryness of a man who has spent 40 years in rooms where things turned out to be different from what they first appeared, "You have been working as a janitor in this building." "Maintenance," Cole said. "The classification on the employment form is maintenance." Reardon looked at him for a moment, then without looking away. "Did anyone ever ask?" Cole held his gaze. "Did you get a sense?" Reardon continued, and his voice had not changed in volume or pace, but had acquired something that this was a company where that question got asked. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when a question has removed the possibility of comfortable non-answers. Diane's jaw was set. The engineer was looking at his hands. Paige Sellers had stopped writing. "I wore a uniform," Cole said. The uniform told everyone what they needed to know. He said it without bitterness, without the edge that would have made it an attack. He said it as a fact the way he would have stated a pressure reading or a load-bearing capacity. The accuracy of it was the thing that made it land the way it did. Diane looked at him, and for the first time since she had stepped off the elevator that morning, her expression was not readable in the single-layer way it had been. There was something beneath the control, something that the morning's events had surfaced against her intention. She did not acknowledge it, but she did not dismiss it either. Then Ray's voice came through the conference room speaker he had patched in from the hangar, which meant he had found something in the firmware data that he had decided couldn't wait. "I've pulled the raw history," Ray said. "Cole, you need to see this. There's more than one modification." The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically, but Cole felt it, and he could see that Reardon felt it too, and that Diane Ashworth, who had built a company by feeling the temperature of every room she was in before anyone else felt it most of all. "How many?" Cole asked. Ray's pause lasted 2 seconds, which was long enough to be significant. 7, Ray said. "Over 6 weeks. Each one small enough to stay under threshold." Cole looked at Diane. She was looking at the speaker, not at him. "Someone," Cole said to the room, and to no one in particular, "has been building this failure one piece at a time." The pilot on the monitor touched his oxygen mask again. The engineer looked up from his hands. And Diane Ashworth, who had fired Cole Decker before 8 o'clock that morning for being in a place he didn't belong, sat at the head of her table and understood with the particular cold clarity of a woman who does not deceive herself for long that the man she had dismissed was the only one in the building who knew how deep this went. Ray Kowalski was not a man who used words like bombshell or revelation. He was the kind of engineer who described catastrophic failure in the same tone he used to order lunch because in his experience the universe did not respond to emotional vocabulary and neither did data. So when he said through the conference room speaker that there were 7 modifications over 6 weeks, each calibrated to stay beneath the automated alert threshold, he said it the way he said everything flatly precisely without performance, which was why it hit the boardroom the way it did. There was no drama to absorb, no tone to argue with. There was only the number 7 and the duration 6 weeks and the implication that threaded between them like a wire pulled taut. Diane Ashworth stood up. Not abruptly, she was not a woman who moved abruptly, but with the deliberate verticality of someone who has decided that sitting is no longer the appropriate physical relationship to have with a problem. She looked at the conference speaker as though Ray were in it rather than simply transmitting through it. 7 modifications, she said, and the repetition was not for clarification. It was the sound of a woman reformatting her understanding of the last 6 weeks of her company's history. Each one individually within tolerance. Ray's voice came back steady. Below threshold, yes. Any single one of them would have passed standard automated review. It's the sequence that creates the failure condition. Individually, they're noise. Together, they're a very specific kind of signal. Tom Reardon had his phone face up again, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Cole with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward in real time. Sandra Lim had stopped writing and was sitting very still in the manner of someone whose stillness is a form of attention rather than absence. The engineer near the window had the look Cole had seen before in people who were doing the math on their own culpability. Not guilt exactly, but the preliminary calculations that precede guilt, the working out of what you should have caught and why you didn't. Cole looked at Diane. "I need to see the access credentials on each modification," he said, "not just the most recent one. All 7 with timestamps and the account identifiers that pushed them." Diane looked at him with an expression that had shed one layer of the careful professional control she had maintained since they'd entered this room. What was underneath it was not panic. She was too experienced for panic, but it was something adjacent to it, a tightly managed version of the fear that comes when you understand that a problem is larger than the boundaries you initially assigned it. "Ray," she said, "bring Cole into the raw data, whatever he needs to see." There was no hesitation in it, which told Cole something. She was capable under sufficient pressure of setting aside the hierarchy she had enforced all morning without apparent difficulty. The question was what kind of pressure it took and whether the lesson would outlast the crisis. He filed that observation without acting on it. He left the boardroom without ceremony and went back downstairs. The hangar had settled into the particular organized urgency of a technical team that has survived an emergency and is now in the process of converting adrenaline into procedure. External assessment teams had set up a perimeter around the Skyguard 7. 2 engineers were photographing the skid damage with the systematic thoroughness of people building a record. The pilot had been fully transported to the medical station, which meant the tarmac held only the machine and the people assigned to evaluate it, and the machine sat in the flat morning light with the stoic permanence of things that have been through worse than they look. Cole passed through the hangar door, and Ray was already at the primary workstation, the raw firmware log open across 3 monitors in cascading windows that showed 6 weeks of system history in a format that was not designed for human reading, but that Cole could read the way he read most things that mattered by looking for the pattern underneath the surface. He sat down. Ray pulled a chair beside him without being asked. The first thing Cole established was the spacing. 7 modifications, 6 weeks, which meant roughly 1 per week but not evenly distributed. The first 3 were clustered in the initial 2 weeks, each one small, each one touching a different subsystem, each one below the threshold by a margin that was consistent enough to suggest precision rather than luck. Someone had tested the alert parameters before building on them. Then a gap of 10 days with no activity. Then the final 4 modifications in the last 2 weeks progressively deeper, each one building on the foundation of the previous ones in a way that would be invisible unless you could see all 7 simultaneously and map their cumulative effect on the stabilizer feedback architecture. "Someone ran a calibration phase first," Cole said. Ray leaned in. "The first 3 modifications don't accomplish anything on their own. They're measuring the system's response, finding out exactly how much change the automated review would tolerate without flagging." Ray was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen. "That's not the behavior of someone who was trying to cut corners on a timeline," he said. Cole nodded. "No," he said. "That's the behavior of someone who understood the system well enough to reverse engineer its blind spots." The word someone sat between them with specific weight because both of them were already thinking about what kind of someone this required, and what kind of access, and what kind of knowledge, and the intersection of those three things was not a large circle. Cole pulled up the account credentials on all 7 entries. The name attached to each modification was the same P. Nolan Subcontractor Software Integration Phase, contract end date 3 weeks prior. Cole looked at the end date. He looked at the most recent modification timestamp. The account had been used 4 times after the contract end date, including twice in the final week. This account should have been deactivated when his contract closed, Cole said. Ray's response was a controlled exhale through his nose, which in Ray's vocabulary was the equivalent of a longer statement. "It deactivates on a cycle," Ray said. 30 days post-contract unless flagged for early closure. Was it flagged? No. Cole looked at the gap between those two facts, the contract end date and the 30-day deactivation cycle, and understood that the gap had been known by the person who used it, because you do not use a dead man's keycard unless you have first confirmed that the lock hasn't been changed. "Where is Pete Nolan now?" Cole asked. Ray picked up his radio and put the question to building security. The answer came back in under a minute, delivered in the flat tone of someone reading from a screen. Rather than from observation, Pete Nolan's vehicle was not in the employee or contractor lot. His company-issued phone had gone dark at 7:23 that morning. He had not badged in or out through any monitored entrance since the previous afternoon. Cole looked at the Skyguard 7 through the hangar window. The certification flight had been scheduled for 8:11 a.m. Pete Nolan's phone had gone dark 48 minutes before that. "He left before the flight," Cole said. "Not after the failure. Before the flight." Ray understood the implication without Cole stating it. You don't leave before the flight unless you know the flight isn't going to end the way the schedule says it will. Diane had come downstairs by then with Reardon and Sandra Lim behind her, and Paige Sellers conspicuously absent, which Cole noted. Diane positioned herself at the edge of the workstation cluster close enough to hear without inserting herself into the technical exchange, which was itself a change from the morning's version of Diane, who had inserted herself into every exchange with the ease of someone who had never needed permission. She was learning the room in real time, which was either a genuine recalibration or a tactical adjustment, and Cole didn't have enough data yet to determine which. "Pete Nolan," Reardon said, looking at the credentials on the screen. "Who brought him onto the project?" Ray pulled up the contractor approval chain. It went through 2 administrative layers and ended at a name Cole had not yet encountered: Grant Holloway, Senior Integration Engineer, 3 years with Halverson, the man who had built the civilian software overlay on top of the Sentinel acquisition architecture. Grant Holloway had approved Pete Nolan's contractor clearance. Grant Holloway had been Pete Nolan's direct technical supervisor during the integration phase, and Grant Holloway's name was not on any of the 7 modification entries, which was either because he had nothing to do with them or because he was careful enough not to leave it there. Cole looked at the modification entries again. He looked at the specific systems each one had touched. He looked at the sequence of subsystems and the particular way the 4th modification had interfaced with a control pathway that existed in the Sentinel legacy layer beneath the civilian surface, the layer that Cole had activated during the emergency override, the layer that Halverson's engineers had not known was there. Someone had known it was there. Someone had known exactly how to reach it, and exactly how to introduce a fault into it that would not activate until the aircraft was airborne, and executing the specific maneuver sequence of a certification flight. That level of knowledge did not belong to a software tester. That level of knowledge belonged to someone who had been inside the architecture for years, and who had understood perhaps better than anyone on the team what the Sentinel acquisition had actually brought into the building. "We saw small glitches in the pre-flight diagnostics," the head engineer said from behind Cole. He had come down from the boardroom and was standing slightly outside the cluster, speaking with the reluctant precision of someone who is acknowledging something they wish they had acknowledged earlier. "Calibration anomalies, we thought. small variations in the stabilizer response curves. We flagged them for post-certification review. Cole turned to look at him. The man met his gaze with the steadiness of someone who knows an accounting is coming and has decided to face it. "You were watching the system report on itself," Cole said, using the same layer the modifications had compromised. "The alerts you were looking for were being generated by the same infrastructure that had been altered. You were reading a thermometer that had been told to always show normal." The room processed that. Reardon sat down in the nearest chair, which was not something Cole had seen him do since entering the hangar. Sandra Lim was writing again. Diane looked at the modification history, and then looked at Cole, and then looked at the name at the top of the contractor approval chain, and when she looked at that name, her expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but that Cole caught because he had been watching her the way he watched rooms for the small movements that preceded the large ones. "I need to find Pete Nolan," Cole said, "and I need to see where Grant Holloway is right now." Diane reached for her radio. Building security confirmed Grant Holloway had badged in at his standard time that morning and had been in the building as of his last recorded movement 40 minutes ago, which meant he was still here, which meant he either didn't know the investigation had started or he had decided for reasons of his own to stay. Cole filed that without expression. "Don't contact him yet," he said. "Don't tell security to flag him or watch him or do anything that changes how the building feels to him right now." Diane looked at him. "If he knows we're looking," Cole said, "he changes his behavior and then we're working against a man who's adjusting rather than a man who thinks he has time." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she spoke quietly to the guard beside her, countermanding the standard escalation protocol she would otherwise have issued. The guard nodded and stepped away. It was then that one of the technicians came through the hangar door from the direction of the secondary bay, moving with the compressed urgency of someone carrying information they haven't fully processed yet. "There's a process running in the south wing server room," he said. "Active right now. It's accessing the backup log archive, certification flight data, pre-flight records, integration history. It's not a scheduled maintenance operation." Cole was already standing. "It's a purge," he said. "Someone is trying to delete the records from the inside." The technician blinked. "How do you—" "Because the flight failed and the records are the next thing that needs to disappear," Cole said. "How far along is the process?" "We don't know. It was flagged by the anomaly monitor 3 minutes ago." 3 minutes. Cole looked at Ray. "Can you trigger an emergency lockdown on the server room systems from here? Not a shutdown, a freeze. Lock every active process in place without killing it." Ray was already at the keyboard. "It's going to interrupt active sessions across the whole south wing," he said. "It is going to have questions." "It can have all the questions they want in an hour," Cole said. Ray executed the command. The lockdown triggered with a system-wide alert tone that moved through the building like a single declarative note. Technicians in the hangar looked up. Somewhere above them in the offices and corridors of the south wing screens would have frozen mid-operation and doors would have switched to emergency security mode. Cole was moving before the tone finished. He went through the side corridor toward the maintenance wing because the south wing server room had 2 access points and the one the maintenance staff used was 30 seconds faster than the main entrance, and 30 seconds was the kind of margin that separated outcomes. He went through the east maintenance corridor first because the relay device question had not yet been answered, and because the maintenance wing was where the answer lived. The corridor was exactly as he had left it every Thursday for 14 months. The pipe clusters overhead, the fluorescent panels with the third one from the east end that always flickered slightly, the smell of coolant and industrial cleaning compound that was the background atmosphere of a building's functional interior. He knew this hallway the way he knew the stabilizer command sequence, not because he had studied it, but because he had been inside it enough times that it had become a part of the physical vocabulary of his body. He stopped at workstation 12. The workstation was positioned in the back corner of the secondary technical bay behind a stack of equipment casing that made it visible from the main bay entrance only if you specifically looked for it. Cole had cleaned around it every week. He had noted in the offhand way he noted most things in the building that it was the workstation that was most often occupied after hours when the building's occupancy dropped and the floor monitoring went to skeleton mode. He crouched down and ran his hand along the underside of the desk, along the cable management channel, along the junction between the desk frame and the rear wall panel. His fingers found it at the back corner, adhered to the underside of the frame with the kind of mounting tape that leaves no residue and holds under temperature variation. A relay transmitter approximately the size of a deck of cards but thinner, its indicator light currently dark because the lockdown had cut power to non-essential peripheral devices. He peeled it free and held it up. Ray, who had followed him, looked at it with the expression of a man who had just found a structural fault in a wall he had trusted. "That's a signal bridge," Cole said. "It was routing commands from this workstation through a masked port that doesn't exist in your building's standard network architecture. Anything executed here would appear in the logs as originating from a different access point or from no identifiable access point at all." Reardon, who had kept pace with them through the corridor, spoke carefully. "So the modifications weren't coming from Pete Nolan's account because Pete was here." Cole turned the device in his fingers. "Pete may have been here, but the commands weren't his. Someone was using this to insert instructions into the system using Pete's credentials while appearing to come from somewhere else entirely." Sandra Lim was in the corridor entrance behind them. "Which means," she said, "that Pete Nolan may not have understood what he was facilitating." Cole looked at her. "Pete Nolan is 31 years old and wanted to impress a senior engineer," he said. "I think he understood very little of what he was facilitating." The weight of that settled into the hallway. It changed the shape of the story they were building, because a story with a knowing accomplice was a story about conspiracy, and a story with an unknowing tool was a story about something colder, about the kind of person who looks at an ambitious young man and sees a mechanism rather than a human being. Cole powered down the relay device and handed it to Ray. "Don't process it through the standard IT chain," he said. "If whoever placed it has any remaining access to building systems, a standard IT intake will generate a log entry they might see." Ray took it with the care of someone handling evidence because that's what it was. They moved on. The south wing server room was at the end of a secondary corridor that ran parallel to the main executive suite service hall. The door was standard security issue badge access, and the lockdown had shifted it to a restricted state that required a supervisor override rather than a standard credential. Diane pressed her badge against the reader and held it for the 3-second count. The lock released. Cole opened the door. The server room was cold in the way that purpose-built data environments are cold, a precise managed cold that exists to preserve equipment rather than to accommodate the people who occasionally enter it. The tower units ran in 4 parallel rows, their indicator lights in a continuous low pattern that the freeze had rendered static rather than cycling small blue points of light in an otherwise dim enclosure. The air smelled of circulated electricity and the specific cleanness of spaces that are filtered rather than ventilated. Cole moved between the first 2 rows and scanned the active displays at the end of each tower unit. The purge process had been running on the 3rd row from the left. The freeze had caught it mid-execution. The progress bar on the terminal display stopped at 63%. 63% of the certification and pre-flight records had been deleted. 37% remained held in place by Ray's lockdown command. 37% was enough. Cole knew this immediately with the practical certainty of a man who understood what data was worth and what it could prove. 63% was a loss, but 63% of a corroborating record was not the same as no record. The remaining 37%, if it contained the right material, and he suspected it did, because the first 63% of a deletion operation targets the most accessible records, not necessarily the most significant ones, was recoverable and evidentiary. Then he heard the sound. It was small, the kind of sound a space makes when it's been occupied and a person inside it has shifted position after holding very still. It came from the far end of the last server row beyond the 4th tower unit in the narrow gap between the final rack and the east wall. Cole didn't move toward it immediately. He looked at Ray, who had heard it too. Ray's face was still. Cole tilted his head slightly toward the gap, and Ray turned to position himself at the row entrance, a natural blocking position that required no communication because both of them understood the geometry without needing to discuss it. Cole walked to the end of the last row. He turned the corner into the narrow space between the final rack and the east wall. Grant Holloway was standing there with his back to the wall and a portable drive in his right hand, and the expression of a man who had prepared multiple contingencies and was currently evaluating which one was still viable. He was 49 years old and thin in the way that people who forget to eat during periods of high stress are thin, and he wore his seniority in the specific set of his jaw and the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of surprise, but of assessment. He did not attempt to push past Cole. He did not reach for a phone. He stood against the wall with the portable drive, and he looked at Cole the way Cole had been looked at upstairs that morning, with the measuring attention of someone trying to determine the precise nature of the thing in front of them. "I wondered which one of you would come first," Grant said. His voice was even. Not cold, not aggressive. Even in the way that voices are, even when the person speaking has been rehearsing internal conversations for long enough that the external version has lost its edge. Cole said nothing. He looked at Grant and waited because the man had been alone in a server room with a drive and a decision for some amount of time and had not yet executed whatever his last option was. And when people with options choose not to use them immediately, it means they are waiting for something, a response, a recognition, an acknowledgement that what they've done has been understood on its own terms. Diane appeared at the end of the row. Then Reardon. Then Sandra Lim. Grant's eyes moved across them without particular alarm. "Grant," Diane said. His name in her mouth had a specific quality, not warmth, but the recognition of years of the particular professional intimacy that develops between people who have worked long hours in the same building toward the same stated goal. "You've been with us for 3 years," she said. Grant looked at her. 3 years and 4 safety warnings, he said, which is a different sentence. Cole watched Grant's face while Diane absorbed that. The 4 safety warnings were real. He had already suspected it from the modification sequence, from the knowledge depth the sabotage had required, from the profile of a man who had understood the system in ways that exceeded his job description. People who build failures that precise have usually spent years trying to prevent the failure first. "We cut the budget 3 times, Grant continued, and now there was something beneath the even voice, not loudness but pressure, the pressure of something that had been compressed for a long time finding its way toward the surface. 3 times in 2 years, and every time the cuts came from the technical team, not from the marketing department, not from the executive suite, from the people who actually understood what we were building and what it would take to build it without killing someone." Diane was very still. "And your solution," Reardon said, "was to make sure someone died anyway." Grant's jaw tightened. "My solution," he said, "was to make sure the failure was visible enough that it couldn't be managed away. The certification flight was insured. The aircraft was a prototype. No one was supposed to—" He stopped. Cole watched him stop and understood what had stopped him. "No one was supposed to what?" Cole said. His voice was quiet. He wasn't asking to challenge. He was asking because the sentence needed to be finished, because the end of the sentence was where Grant had been living for however long he had been working toward this morning, and the end of the sentence was the thing Grant had told himself that made everything before it acceptable. Grant looked at him. "The pilot was supposed to eject," Grant said. "The failure sequence I designed triggered at an altitude where ejection was standard protocol. I designed it for an ejectable outcome." Cole held Grant's gaze without blinking. "The ejection system on the Skyguard 7 was deactivated during the pre-certification modification phase," Cole said. 6 weeks ago, which you know because you were in the integration meetings where that decision was documented." The even quality of Grant's voice cracked, not broadly a hairline fracture that someone who hadn't been watching for it would have missed. But Cole had been watching. "You didn't tell the people you'd built the failure," Cole said. He said it the way he had run the emergency override, without heat, without performance, with the precision of a man stating a load-bearing fact. You built a failure designed for one version of the aircraft, and then the aircraft changed and you didn't update the plan. Grant said nothing. The drive was still in his right hand. Cole looked at it. That drive, he said, has the modification history, the access logs, the communication records. Grant's grip on it adjusted. Cole watched the adjustment. "I know what's on it," Grant said. "I made it." Cole nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "You made it because some part of you understood that what happened this morning was going to need explaining. Not to protect yourself, you're past that calculus. You made it because the 4 safety warnings and the 3 budget cuts and the compromised ejection system all need to exist in the same document for the story to be told right. You made it because you want the truth to survive even if you don't." Reardon was watching Cole now with a stillness that matched Ray's, the attention of a man who has realized he's watching something more specific than a confrontation. Grant was looking at the drive in his hand. The blue server lights made the space between them look like the bottom of a lake. "Keystone Dynamics contacted you," Cole said. "After you'd been working on this alone for 6 months and getting nowhere with the internal warnings. They knew about the safety concerns because those concerns were documented and they had access to someone who had seen the documentation." Grant looked up. "They reached out to me," he said. "They said they had contacts at the regulatory level who could force a formal audit if there was evidence of systematic negligence. They said they could make sure the story was told." Cole let a silence develop. Then, "What they told you was that they needed Halverson's flagship program to fail before the DoD contract decision," he said, "and you gave them a mechanism to make that happen. Whether they were going to tell the story or bury it afterward, that part they left ambiguous." Grant was very still. "They said they would ensure transparency," he said. His voice had lost its evenness now, not collapsed, hollowed. The voice of a man who has been holding a conviction for a long time and has just had to look at its foundation. "Transparency for companies that lose regulatory bids tends to look different than transparency for companies that win them," Cole said. "You knew the architecture of this aircraft better than anyone in the building. You didn't extend that precision to the people you were working with." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Grant looked at the drive. He looked at Diane. He looked at Cole. Cole extended his hand palm up without moving toward Grant. Not a demand, not a gesture of authority. An offer, the specific untheatrical offer of a man who was giving another man the chance to put something down. "You want the system to be accountable," Cole said. "That drive is how the system becomes accountable. Destroy it, and you become the story. Give it to me, and the system becomes the story. One of those outcomes is what you spent 3 years trying to achieve." Grant stood against the wall of the server room with the blue lights and the frozen process on the terminal and the 4 people watching him, and he looked at the drive for a long time. Then he placed it in Cole's palm. Cole closed his hand around it. He turned to the guard who had followed them in. The guard looked at Diane. Diane nodded. The guard stepped forward and Grant did not resist, and the sound of the handcuffs in the cold server room was the sound of an ending that was also for the program and the people who depended on it a beginning. Cole looked at the drive in his hand. He looked at the frozen terminal display, 37% of the backup records preserved in place. Then Ray spoke from the row entrance, his voice carrying the flatness of a man delivering one more piece of information that the day has been building toward Cole. "The external communication logs on that drive, I pulled a partial recovery from the cached data while you were working the corridor. The Keystone contact isn't a standard corporate account." Cole looked at him. "The outbound communications Grant was sending to Keystone," Ray said, "were going to a specific individual, VP level, and there's a name attached to the receiving end of those exchanges that I think you're going to recognize." Cole looked at the drive. He looked at Ray. Outside the server room, through the building's structure, through 14 months of corridors and cleaning shifts and silent observation, the day that had started with a badge going dark was arriving at its actual shape. "Tell me the name," Cole said. Ray told him. Cole was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Of course." Not with surprise, with the specific settled recognition of a man who has just seen the last piece of a pattern fit into a space that was always its exact shape. The guard escorted Grant Holloway out of the server room. The blue server lights resumed their cycling as the lockdown protocol began its staged release. Cole stood in the cold air with the drive and looked at the display where 63% of a record had been erased and 37% had been preserved, and he thought about the particular mathematics of what survives and what doesn't, about the difference between the things that get cleaned up and the things that stay in the floor grain no matter how many times you go over them. "Boardroom," Diane said. She was standing at the row entrance with her arms at her sides, and her voice carrying something Cole had not heard in it all morning, not warmth, not humility, but the specific quality of a person who has run out of the particular fuel that keeps you from seeing what's directly in front of you. "There are people upstairs who need to understand what just happened," she said, "and you're the only one who can explain it in a way they'll believe." Cole looked at her. The drive was in his hand. The morning was still going, which seemed improbable given everything it had already contained. Somewhere in the building a guard was walking Grant Holloway through a corridor that Cole knew by heart. Outside on the tarmac, the Skyguard 7 sat in the Arizona morning with its skids bent and its data intact. And in the lobby, or wherever the guard had settled her, Mia Decker was reading the 4th chapter of a book about how machines achieve the unlikely thing of staying airborne. Cole followed Diane out of the server room. The door sealed behind them with a sound like the close of a case being made. The corridor between the server room and the boardroom elevator was 43 steps. Cole had counted them once on a Thursday morning with a mop, not because he needed the number, but because counting was something his mind did when it needed to run in the background while the foreground stayed clear. He counted them again now, not consciously, just as a byproduct of moving through a space he knew at a cellular level, the particular give of the floor beneath the carpet, the way the ventilation changed pitch near the junction with the South Wing service hall. 43 steps. Everything that needed to happen before he reached the boardroom had to be assembled in that distance. Ray fell into step beside him before he reached the elevator. The older man's expression had the quality of controlled deliberateness that Cole had come to recognize as Ray's version of urgency. "The name I pulled from the communication cache," Ray said, keeping his voice below the ambient noise of the building, "is David Park, VP of Strategic Development at Keystone Dynamics." Cole nodded. He had already begun organizing what that meant, the way you organize a workspace before starting a job, clearing the irrelevant, positioning the necessary. "Park reached out to me 14 months ago," Cole said. "Before I started here. He knew my background from the Air Force publications. He offered me a senior systems role at Keystone." Ray looked at him. "You turned it down." "I needed stability," Cole said. "Keystone's experimental division operates on deployment cycles. Mia was 2 years out from losing her mother. I wasn't going to uproot her for a defense contractor's project timeline." Ray was quiet for several steps. "So Park approached Grant after you declined," he said. Cole turned the drive over in his hand, once a habit when he was running calculations. Park knew Halverson had acquired Sentinel's architecture. He knew the legacy systems were imperfectly integrated because the technical concerns had been documented in the contractor filings, which are accessible to anyone with industry standing. When I didn't take the position, he needed someone on the inside with sufficient architectural knowledge to exploit what he already knew existed. He paused. Grant was the most qualified person in the building for that purpose. Park found a man with legitimate grievances and gave him a framework that looked like justice. Ray said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a cold way to use a person." Cole looked at the elevator panel. "Park is very good at what he does," he said. It wasn't admiration. It was the assessment of a man who respects competence and despises its application. What Ray had not yet told him, and what Cole was about to learn when the elevator opened onto the executive floor and a building security supervisor met them in the corridor with a tablet and a clipped summary of the situation's current state, was that the board's 3 senior members had been in a private session since 40 minutes after the crash. Cole absorbed this information the way he absorbed most things without visible reaction, while internally rearranging its implications with speed. The session had been called by Gerald Marsh, the board's longest-serving member who had flown in from Chicago for the certification flight and who had, according to the security supervisor's summary, spent the past 40 minutes on calls with the company's legal counsel and its insurance underwriters. The two near-miss incidents from the previous 18 months had apparently been the subject of a standing conversation among 3 board members that had never surfaced to Diane's level. This morning had converted that conversation from standing to urgent. Cole stopped outside the boardroom doors. Diane was 2 steps ahead of him, and she stopped when he stopped. She turned. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the composition is load-bearing rather than decorative. "They're going to vote," Cole said. "Not a question." Diane held his gaze. "Marsh called the session before we found Grant," she said. "Before we understood what had happened." "That doesn't change what they're going to do with what they know right now," Cole said, "which is that a certification flight failed, a pilot nearly died, and the CEO fired the man who saved the aircraft before the aircraft needed saving." Diane said nothing. The accuracy of it was the thing that kept her silent, not the sting of it, but the precision. She was not a woman who argued with accurate statements, which was one of the things that had made her effective and one of the things that had made her blind, because a mind that only accepts accurate statements tends to define accuracy by what it already believes. "Who presents the evidence in that room matters," Cole said. Diane looked at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, processing, resisting, recalibrating. "You're going to tell me that you should present it," she said. He shook his head. "I'm going to tell you that I'm the only person in this building who can present it in a way that separates the sabotage from the systemic failures, clearly enough that the board understands they are related, but not identical. If I don't do that, they will treat this morning as evidence that the company's oversight culture is broken at the leadership level, and they will not be wrong, but they will be incomplete, and incomplete conclusions in that room will cost the program, and everyone who works on it more than today already has." Diane looked at the boardroom doors. Behind them, Gerald Marsh and 2 other board members were running a calculation that did not yet have all its variables. "And what do you want," she said, "in exchange for walking in there and doing that?" Cole looked at her with the level attention of a man who finds the question neither offensive nor surprising, merely beside the point. "I want the program not to collapse because a vote happens before the facts are complete," he said. "That's the whole of it." Diane held his gaze for 4 seconds, which in her economy of expression was a long time. Then she opened the boardroom doors. The room had changed in configuration from the morning's session. Gerald Marsh, 71 years old, and built like a man who had survived several previous versions of corporate crisis, sat at the head position Diane normally occupied. The 2 other senior board members flanked him. The investors, Reardon, Sandra Lim, and the others occupied the side positions, and the distribution of the room told Cole that Marsh had used the past 40 minutes to establish a different center of gravity in this space. Diane walked to her usual chair and sat in it, which was itself a statement. Cole stood at the far end of the table, the same position he had occupied that morning, except that this time he set the drive on the table in front of him before he looked up. Marsh looked at the drive. He looked at Cole. He looked at Cole's uniform, which was still the maintenance uniform because there had been no interval in the morning long enough or calm enough for anything else, and Cole had long since stopped being self-conscious about what that communication created in rooms like this, because the communication was accurate, and he had decided somewhere in the past 14 months that accurate was the only register he was willing to operate in. "You're the man who stopped the crash," Marsh said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been in too many rooms for too long to waste syllables on anything performative. Cole nodded once. "And you're the man who was fired this morning before the crash occurred," Marsh continued. Cole nodded again. Marsh looked at Diane. She met his gaze without deflection, which cost her something, and Cole could see that it cost her, and he filed that observation in the same place he had filed the earlier one, not to use against her, but because understanding what something costs a person is part of understanding the person. Cole connected the drive to the conference system. The screens came to life with the data he and Ray had spent the past hour building into a coherent sequence: the 7 modifications, the timeline, the credential chain, the relay device, the communication logs. He walked the room through it the way he had walked through emergency protocols in training environments, which was to say, without theatrical emphasis, trusting the material to carry its own weight. He did not editorialize. He did not frame Grant Holloway as a monster or as a victim. He presented the sequence of decisions and the sequence of consequences, and let the board perform their own moral arithmetic, because experienced people in positions of responsibility do not respond well to being told what to conclude, and do respond to being given the accurate components of a conclusion. When he reached the communication logs, he paused. "The Keystone Dynamics contact," he said, "is a VP named David Park." Sandra Lim looked up from her notepad. Reardon set down the pen he had been holding. Marsh's expression didn't change, which was its own form of expression. "Park approached me 14 months ago," Cole said, "before I joined Halverson. He offered me a senior systems role and I declined. At the time I understood it as a standard industry recruitment contact." Looking at the communication pattern between Park and Holloway, the timeline of when Park initiated contact with Grant, and the specific technical knowledge Park's messages demonstrate about Halverson's legacy architecture knowledge that would have been accessible through my USAF publication record, which details the Sentinel system's original design. It is my assessment that when I declined Park's offer, he identified Halverson's internal technical structure as an alternative mechanism for achieving the same outcome. He did not need me to compromise Halverson's program. He needed someone with sufficient access and sufficient grievance. Grant Holloway was both. The room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture, the texture of people holding multiple thoughts in tension and not yet resolving them. Marsh looked at Cole for a long moment. "You understand," Marsh said, "that this implicates a competitor in deliberate sabotage of a certification flight." Cole looked back at him steadily. "I understand that the communication logs indicate coordination between an internal actor and an external party with competitive interests in this program's failure," he said. "The characterization of that coordination is a legal determination, not a technical one. I'm presenting the technical evidence. The characterization belongs to your counsel." Marsh nodded slowly. He was a man who respected precision, and Cole had just demonstrated it in a form Marsh recognized. Reardon leaned forward. "The 37% of backup records that survived the purge," he said, "is that enough to substantiate the modification chain?" Combined with the relay device and the drive, Cole said, "Yes. The 37% contains the pre-integration architecture baseline. It establishes what the system looked like before the modifications and makes the modifications themselves legible as deviations rather than calibrations." Reardon sat back. Sandra Lim closed her notepad, which was the gesture of a person who has received enough information and is moving into decision mode. Marsh looked at Diane. "Your assessment," he said, "of how this happened on your watch." It was not a gentle question. It was not intended to be. Diane looked at the table surface for exactly 2 seconds, not avoiding the question, processing it, and then looked at Marsh with the directness she brought to everything. "I approved 3 budget reductions in the technical division over 2 years, she said. "Each one was justified individually on quarterly metrics. None of them were evaluated against the cumulative effect on the team's capacity to maintain adequate oversight. Grant Holloway submitted 4 safety warnings in that period. I reviewed the executive summaries. I did not read the underlying documentation." She paused. "I built this company on the principle that you trust your hierarchy to surface what matters. I had not examined whether my hierarchy had the resources to surface it." The room was still. Marsh looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Cole. "And you," he said. 14 months in this building. You didn't surface anything either." Cole held the older man's gaze without difficulty. "No one asked me anything," he said. "I was wearing the wrong uniform." Marsh considered that. Something moved behind his expression, not quite a wince, but related to one. "That's going to change," he said. It was not directed at Cole, it was directed at the room and at himself in the manner of a man issuing a correction to a system he participates in. The vote, when it came, was brief, not because the matter was simple, but because the evidence had done its work and the room had reached the place where prolonging the deliberation would have been its own form of avoidance. Marsh called it formally. The result was that Diane Ashworth would remain as CEO with a restructured oversight board that included an independent safety review function reporting directly to that board rather than through the executive chain. The DoD program would continue under enhanced technical governance. And the question of Cole Decker's role was put to the room in the specific way that Marsh put questions not as a motion but as an inquiry directed at the person most qualified to answer it. "What do you need," Marsh said to Cole, "to make sure this aircraft is safe to fly?" Cole looked at the drive on the table. He looked at the screens still displaying the modification sequence and the communication logs and the architecture diagrams. He looked at Reardon and Sandra Lim and the engineers along the wall, and finally at Diane, who was watching him with the particular quality of attention she had been developing across the past 2 hours. Not the sweeping assessment radar of that morning, but something more focused, more honest, carrying the specific weight of a person who is looking at something they did not see before and are determined not to look away from now. "Access to the complete Sentinel Integration Archive," Cole said. "Full authority to flag safety concerns directly to this board without routing through the chain of command. And a formal role with the mandate to audit the system architecture before the next flight and at regular intervals thereafter." Marsh looked at Diane. Diane said, "Director of Systems Safety and Integrity. Full clearance, direct board access, compensation commensurate with the actual qualifications we apparently already had on staff." The words were exact, and they were also, in their exactness, a form of acknowledgement that didn't need to be labeled as one. The vote on the appointment was unanimous, which in Cole's experience was rare enough to mean something. Most unanimous votes in rooms like this were the product of social pressure. This one was the product of a morning that had removed all comfortable alternatives. Cole nodded once. Then, "One more thing." The room waited. "My daughter is 8 years old," he said. "She reads aerospace engineering texts for recreation, and she already understands more about stabilizer feedback than 2 of the technicians I worked with this morning. I want to be able to bring her into the hangar when I'm working, not as a distraction, as a future engineer who deserves to know what her father actually does." The room's response to this was not what Cole might have predicted at 8 o'clock that morning. Marsh looked at him for a beat, and then something moved across the old man's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. The expression of someone who has spent a long day in a room full of complex problems and has just encountered one whose solution is obvious and costs nothing. "That requires no vote," Marsh said. Diane was the last person Cole spoke to before he left the executive floor. She found him in the corridor near the elevator, which was not an accident. She had the specific bearing of someone who has planned an approach and is executing it with more care than her normal pace suggests. She stopped 2 steps from him, and the 2 steps were deliberate, close enough for the conversation to be private, far enough to preserve the boundary that the morning had established between them, the boundary of 2 people who understand each other with sudden clarity and are not yet sure what to do with that clarity. "I fired you based on what I assumed," she said, "not on what I knew." Cole looked at her. "Yes," he said, because it was accurate, and because she had not framed it as a question or as a request for absolution. She had framed it as a statement of fact, which was the only framing he could have respected. "That's going to take me some time to work through," she said. "The gap between what I assumed and what was true is larger than I usually allow for." Cole considered her. The composed face, the controlled posture, and underneath those things visible now in a way it had not been at 8 o'clock, the interior of a person who had built something genuinely impressive, and had also, in the building of it, developed a specific category of blindness that successful people often develop, the blindness of people who have been right enough times that they have started to confuse certainty with accuracy. Grant Holloway wrote 4 safety warnings, Cole said. Read them, not the summaries, the full documentation. Diane held his gaze. I will, she said. And then after a pause that was different from her professional pauses, shorter, less controlled, I don't know how to lead a company that almost killed someone today. Cole looked at her with the steady attention he brought to systems diagnostics, not warm, not cold, functional. You start by reading the 4 warnings, he said, and then you assume the 5th one is already written and you just haven't received it yet. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once the way Mia nodded when she had categorized a piece of information and assigned it to the right place. Cole recognized the gesture with a clarity that surprised him, though he kept that surprise entirely internal. Ray was waiting for him at the hangar exit with Mia, who had been brought up from the lobby by a guard, and who was standing next to Ray with her book under her arm, looking at the Skyguard 7 through the exterior glass with the concentrated attention she brought to any machine she hadn't fully cataloged yet. Cole watched her for a moment before she noticed him. She was studying the damage on the skids with her head slightly tilted, the same angle she used when she was reading a particularly technical passage, and she was talking to Ray in the quiet, matter-of-fact manner she used when she had a technical question and had identified someone qualified to answer it. Ray was listening with the expression of a man who has been surprised by a conversation partner in a way he finds genuinely pleasurable. Cole pushed through the exit door. Mia turned when she heard it. She looked at him with the amber eyes, and she did not run to him because running was for younger children, and Mia considered herself past that threshold, but she crossed to him at a pace that covered the distance quickly, and she put her hand in his with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone claiming something that has always been theirs. Ray says you designed part of that helicopter, she said. Cole looked at Ray, who gave a slight shrug that communicated both accuracy and mild amusement. Part of the system inside it, Cole said, not the helicopter itself. Mia considered this distinction and appeared to accept it as technically valid. Is that why you knew how to fix it? Cole looked at her. That's part of it, he said. The other part is that I've been paying attention to how things break for a long time. She nodded. Then she looked back at the aircraft and said in the tone she used when she was confirming something she had already worked out independently, "It failed because the resonance frequency in the stabilizer loop wasn't being properly damped. The feedback just kept amplifying." Ray made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space. Chapter 7, Mia added for completeness. Ray looked at Cole with an expression that said without any ambiguity, this child should be in this building. They sat outside on the concrete barrier as the Arizona afternoon gathered itself around them. The floodlights on the airfield were still running the Skyguard 7, surrounded by assessment teams whose movements had settled from emergency urgency into the measured pace of thorough documentation. The sky was still the clean blue from the morning, unchanged by everything that had happened beneath it, indifferent in the way that sky is indifferent, which Cole had never found depressing and had always found clarifying. Things continued. The work continued. You found the failure, you understood it, you built the repair, and then the next thing that needed attention made itself known. Mia was reading again, her shoulder against his arm, her finger moving along a line of text with the tracing habit she had when she was working through something complex. Cole sat with the drive in his jacket pocket and the new title on a piece of paper in the boardroom upstairs, and the weight of a day that had started with a number in a bank account and ended somewhere he could not have navigated to from that starting point by any route he would have chosen. But routes you wouldn't have chosen were sometimes the only ones that led somewhere worth reaching. He had learned that in the Air Force, and then forgotten it, and then over 14 months of Thursday floors and quiet corridors begun to remember it without knowing he was remembering. His phone showed a missed call from an unknown number. He opened the voicemail. David Park's voice came through clear and professional, carrying the easy confidence of a man who has not yet updated his model of the day's events. "Cole, I heard about the incident this morning. Rough day for Halverson. Listen, the offer I made you 14 months ago is still on the table. Keystone has a senior systems position that I think you'd find considerably more interesting than where you're currently working. Call me back when you get a chance." Cole listened to the message to its end. He looked at the phone. He looked at Mia, who had turned a page. He looked at the Skyguard 7 on the tarmac, battered and upright in the late morning light, surrounded by the people whose job it now was to understand every way it had been compromised and to build it back to something that could carry a person safely into the air and return them. He deleted the message. The phone screen went dark and he put it in his pocket, and that was the end of that particular calculation. Mia turned another page. The assessment teams moved around the aircraft with their clipboards and their cameras. Somewhere in the building, Gerald Marsh was on a call with legal counsel. Somewhere else, Ray Kowalski was beginning the process of pulling the full Sentinel integration archive and building the audit structure that Cole had described with the focused efficiency of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask him to do the right thing and has not had to wait as long as he feared. Pete Nolan was being located at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the building, sitting with his hands around a cup he hadn't touched, and when the officer sat down across from him and told him what the modification chain had done and what his credentials had been used for, Pete Nolan's expression was going to be the expression of a young man who had wanted to impress someone and had not known the cost of the impression, and that was its own kind of consequence that Cole didn't need to witness to understand. "Bored yet?" Cole asked Mia. She turned a page without looking up. "I'm on the chapter about tail rotor torque compensation," she said. "It's actually more complicated than I thought." Cole looked at the Skyguard 7's tail boom, which was one of the sections that had sustained visible stress in the landing. Tomorrow he would start with the tail rotor assembly and work forward through the airframe, and the day after that he would begin the firmware audit, and the day after that the Sentinel integration documentation, and the week after that the safety warning archive that started with Grant Holloway's first filing 2 years ago and ended with a drive in a server room and a man in handcuffs, and 37% of a record preserved by a freeze command executed in time by someone who had understood that what survives is what you protect before the damage reaches it. He thought about Mia at the fence that morning, standing exactly where he had told her to stand, holding her book, waiting. He thought about the way she had not cried, not because she was too young to understand, but because she understood well enough to know that crying would have been for her, not for him, and she had chosen him. 8 years old, and already making that distinction. He thought about what he had modeled for her over 2 years of careful distance. The closed doors, the managed warmth, the love that was real and was also beneath its reliability, a form of protection he had been providing primarily for himself. She had learned from him. Children learn from what you do rather than what you intend, which was either the most clarifying or the most humbling fact of parenthood, and in Cole's experience it was usually both simultaneously. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him the way she always did, easily, without making it a moment, the way you lean into something you are certain will hold. The afternoon light moved across the airfield. The machines were assessed and documented and understood. The building behind them was full of people doing the work that the morning had made necessary. "When do we come back?" Mia asked. Cole thought about the Sentinel archive and the firmware audit and the 4 safety warnings that needed to be read in full and the tail rotor assessment and the 43 steps he had counted in a corridor that he would be counting again tomorrow, but differently, not in the background of a mind keeping itself occupied, but in the foreground of a man moving through a space that was now formally and functionally his responsibility. "Tomorrow," he said. Mia nodded with the decisive finality she reserved for information that required no further processing. She turned a page. The Skyguard 7 stood on the tarmac in the Arizona light, imperfect and intact, which was not the worst thing a machine could be, and was in fact the condition from which all genuine repair began.